Good. If any of those people on the edges would like to sort of come across, that would be fantastic. We'd love to have you in the sort of middle part of the room. So good morning. My name is Liz de Chastel. I'm the Executive Director of Policy at the Australian Local Government Association, and I'm very delighted to welcome you here today on a session really focused on local government and some of the opportunities, but also the barriers for local government in addressing housing. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which the Brisbane Convention and Exhibition Centre now stands, and I offer my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's connections to land, sea and community, and respect their cultural, spiritual and educational practices. I'd also like to thank Bridge Housing for their support of the conference as the sponsor for this session. And just so you know, this session is being streamed and recorded and will be available for delegates to view after the conference. So today we'll be taking questions both online and from in the room itself. For those of you joining us online, please use the Q&A tab to the right of your screen. You'll also find a copy of any presentations today in the handout section, again on the right-hand side of your screen. And for those of you who are in the room, if you do wish to ask a question, we ask that you please keep your questions succinct to enable us to get through as many as possible. And I'd also just encourage you not to start talking until the microphone is in front of you, because we do have the online audience and they can't hear unless you have a microphone. Before I also go further, I'd also like to acknowledge the people who have lived experience of housing vulnerability, who are at the conference either as presenters or delegates. Your voices are important in shaping better housing outcomes for the future. And because I have got the stage, I am going to talk a little bit about local governments and some of the national sort of issues that we've been involved with. For those of you who don't know, the Australian Local Government Association is a small secretariat based in Canberra. We are a federated organisation, so we work very closely with our state and territory local government associations. So some of you might have done work with these organisations in your own state. We represent collectively the 537 local governments across the country. Okay. Can I just get my slides up there, please? Thank you. So across the country, the 537 local governments employ close to 190,000 workers and manage about $500 billion of assets. But we only raise about 3.5% of Australia's total taxation revenue. And we know through our work that the shortage of affordable housing is one of the top issues facing councils in their communities. And the impacts and concerns around these issues comes up in pretty much every policy discussion that we get involved with, particularly at the national level. So we know that housing is the problem, but it's also the solution to some of these issues. For example, some of the national discussions we get involved with around like closing the gap targets, workforce shortages, dealing with natural disasters, social cohesion, and overseas migration, to name a few. But we also know that local governments are doing some of the heavy lifting on the ground with their communities to support more affordable housing. And we just heard in the last session some great examples of this as well, and we've heard through the conference too. And there's a lot of innovation going across the country by local governments, and even in areas that they don't traditionally do work in as well. So local governments are managers of their local places, and they have a footprint in every single community. And this makes us different from other levels of government in that we do have a presence pretty much everywhere across the country. And a lot of the councils are doing things like, for example, housing strategies, which we heard about before, housing advocacy for their communities, looking at housing diversity, inclusionary zoning, developing partnerships and encouraging partnerships in their communities. Some are developing land and some are also building houses as well. But we also know that there are some major challenges for our sector in supporting the housing crisis that we've got. And some of these include financial sustainability and the costs of providing infrastructure for councils, council workforce shortages, especially around planners and engineers, planning, and we've seen this in some jurisdictions where planning decisions are taken outside or removed from local communities altogether. We also have communities that are concerned about the changes going on in their towns and suburbs around densification and increased traffic, for example. And we've also got specific issues around thin markets in regional and rural areas across the country. So just some of the things, I just wanted to quickly touch on some of the things, just so that you know, I guess, that ELGA, as representing local governments, is involved in some of the big national conversations around housing. So we deal directly with the federal government or the national level, so we are involved in some of the discussions around that. For example, we're a signatory to the National Housing Accord. We've also been working recently with the Federal Department of Social Services to ensure that we have a say in the National Housing and Homelessness Plan. We're a member of the Planning Ministers' Council, and we also participate in other ministerial councils. We've done a presentation to National Cabinet, for example, and also the Federal Treasurers. We also have a representative, and he's actually in the room today, who was the local government representative on the National Housing and Affordability Supply Council. So we appreciate David O'Loughlin's representation on behalf of our sector onto that council as well. So while we are doing a lot of work nationally, and also I should have also mentioned the NIFIC, the recent housing financing, the rollout of the big housing bill as well. We've been involved in discussions with Treasury and others around that as well. So while we're doing that, we also know that our state and territory local government associations are also doing a lot of work with their councils in their state, but also with their state and territory governments as well. So the housing issues, as I said, they impact differently across the country. There's different impacts and issues that we see across the country. So earlier the other panel was talking about the impact of short-term accommodation impacting on some communities, the ability of councils to attract GPs into their communities or to employ new staff to work on their councils. And for the first time, a lot of councils are also dealing with the issue of homelessness, rough sleepers in their parks that they've never had to deal with before. We also see the desire for alternative housing types and diversity with the ageing population or multicultural communities, for example. And in a very sort of emerging area for councils, we had about 300 councils affected by natural disasters in the last 12 months to 2 years. So there are a lot of issues around rebuilding, looking at areas we can build on, temporary housing, etc. in those communities as well. So just in summary, and just to help this discussion, obviously one size fits all across the country is not going to work. And we do really need sort of place-based type of solutions. And councils are really well placed to advise what works well in their own communities. So, and at this session, we've got 3 fantastic speakers here. We're going to hear some ideas and possible solutions. So we've got a Metro Council representative here. We've got a government worker that does a lot of work with councils and community housing providers and helping with those partnerships. And we also have a researcher who's done a lot of recent research about council's view on tiny homes. So some great insights here. So each of the speakers will talk for about 15 minutes, and then I'll open it up for audience question and discussion. So I'll just introduce the speakers. I'll only do this once, and then I'll get them to come up. So our first speaker is Humair Ahmad, and Humair is the Director of Community Housing in New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice, and is a social and affordable housing specialist. He's played a direct role in the growth of the community housing sector in New South Wales by leading initiatives such as the Social Housing Management Transfer Program, the Community Housing Innovation Fund, and Together Home. He has also worked on the Asset Vesting Program and more recently helped design the services stream of the Social and Affordable Housing Fund. The second speaker is Glenn Menner. Glenn's with Brimbank City Council in Melbourne's West and is a social policy and planning practitioner with 25 years' experience in both local government and the community sector. Since working in dedicated housing roles for NGOs in the 1990s and as a state delegate for National Shelter, he has found his true home in local government. That's fantastic. Glenn, I like those words. Glenn's specialist expertise in housing ranges from strategic policy, research and advocacy through to leveraging funding and facilitating partnerships with community housing providers to deliver social housing. In his role at Brimbank, he conducted research in housing need, which informed the development of a homelessness implementation plan and a social and affordable housing position statement. And our final speaker, who's actually a local and might be known to some of you in Queensland, Dr. Heather Shearer, is a lecturer and researcher at Griffith University. And her research includes the tiny house movement, the use of artificial intelligence in spatial analysis, active transport modelling, and general housing affordability. And she teaches geographic information systems, spatial analysis, and environmental futures. So as I said, we'll hear from the three speakers for about 15 minutes each. And then I'd like you to start thinking about sort of some questions that you might want to ask so that we can have a great discussion after that. So I'll hand over to Humair first. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to all elders present, past, and emerging. Just trying to make sure that the slides, hang on. Yeah. So as Liz mentioned, I'm the Director of Community Housing at the Department of Communities and Justice, and the sole reason for the existence of my branch is to support the growth and diversity of community housing in New South Wales. And we sort of work with the sector to deliver a range of products, all the way from crisis, transitional, social, and of course affordable. So the topic of discussion today is the affordable housing delivery, and I will focus on some real life examples of how the state government, or my branch particularly, has worked with councils to deliver deliver affordable housing and operationalize a lot of those schemes. And the mechanisms are quite straightforward and you're aware of, but I think just providing some live examples makes it real and demystifies the whole delivery aspect of it. So moving along, so why is the state government interested in affordable housing? And that's obviously, like, you know, it's quite self-evident, and I'll probably go into a bit more detail in the next slides. But today I want to speak about affordable housing as a distinct discount to market product, not affordable housing affordability generally, where, you know, you just have a lot of housing in the private market and it's affordable. So I'm talking about a distinct product which is either discount to market rent, or it could be income-based rents as well if the market is quite high. And we have a very detailed set of guidance in New South Wales called the Ministerial Guidelines on Affordable Housing that provides a lot of detail on rent setting. So as you all know, it is a sub-market product, right? So it needs a subsidy. And the subsidy can come in any form. It could come in the form of direct grants, which we do as a state government. We provide a lot of direct grants. It could be through land contributions, and I'm increasingly working with a lot of councils in New South Wales who actually granted land to community housing providers to build affordable housing. And then, of course, there's a whole heap of planning mechanisms that you're well aware of, especially the people from councils here, which are, inclusive zoning, contribution schemes, density bonuses, voluntary planning agreements, and I'll touch on a few of those in my subsequent slides. And in New South Wales, we've recognized the not-for-profit community housing sector as the key delivery partner, and that's the delivery of affordable housing through registered community housing providers is part of our legislation as well. So as I said before, why are we interested? We have, as you all know, a lot of social housing tenants across the country, and for a social housing tenant to exit into the private market is a very scary proposition, especially with the way the private markets are at the moment. So we believe that affordable housing can be a stepping stone as an exit from social housing, just gives them more options for people who can exit. I know that a lot of social housing clients are unable to exit. We definitely, as one of the objectives is to grow the affordable housing through the community housing sector in New South Wales, is to strengthen community housing provider viability, because we know that the rent and income profile from affordable housing can often subsidize some of their social housing operations. We, of course, want to support regional economies. Affordability is no longer a metro problem. I think all regional councils will be experiencing severe stress in that area, inability to attract workers. So yes, we definitely want to support regional economies. And of course, wherever in regional or metro areas, we want to support key workers to be able to live closer to work. Like, we don't want a nurse or a policeman or even a cleaner having to travel 2 hours just to get to work and then having to do a night shift or then travel 2 hours back to their homes. And of course, any supply is good. So I think a lot has been said about general supply, and we need to increase a lot of general supply, but I believe we need to increase more subsidized products. Investment on the lower end of the market will really relieve pressure in terms of rents. While I think even in the session this morning, it was flagged that even with 200,000-300,000 dwellings in a particular area, the impact on rents lowering is minimal, like 4%. So we definitely need more investment in specific affordable housing products, not just general supply. We need general supply as well, but we need more focus on the lower end. So in New South Wales, we have 3 agencies who sort of are involved in the delivery of affordable housing. My department, we provide grant funding. We work with councils to operationalize affordable housing schemes. We provide data and tools. We monitor delivery, where we have delivery agreements with councils, and we guide ongoing management of affordable housing. And that's what I said before, which is the Affordable Housing Guidelines, which is the only operational guidelines available on eligibility, on income, on how to manage affordable housing. Landcom, of course, is another partner. It's a government developer who delivers affordable housing on the sites it develops where it's financially feasible. LAC, again, is a major land-owning entity that has mainly social housing in its stock, but increasingly, as it's doing redevelopment of its larger sites, it's trying to incorporate affordable housing on those developments as well. So this is just a blatant plug for what I do. So just bear with me. So what we can assist councils with, and this is based on our examples of working with multiple councils across New South Wales, is that we can support councils on the end-to-end delivery of the dwellings themselves, including tendering, setting leveraging targets if required, contracting, reporting, supply and tenant outcomes. And what that really says is that as a housing agency, we have all the infrastructure already set up in the department. So if any council wants to embark on this journey of delivering affordable housing in their respective jurisdictions, they don't need to recreate the whole infrastructure. They can lean in on some of the stuff we already have. And we've been sharing our sort of documents, certain documents, various collateral freely with councils if they want to do it themselves. But if they want to partner with us, we are more than happy to help deliver the affordable housing. We have a lot of formalized relations with councils through delivery agreements, and as an agency that has a lot of existing contract and reporting relations to the councils, with CHP, CHPs, and we have all the regular quarterly reporting infrastructure set up, councils can even rely on that for us. So if you are delivering a project through a community housing provider, we can help you monitor the progress of those projects and also ongoing management of those, because we have a regular quarterly data collection system already in place. So this slide is important because this is what we've seen in our practice. So this is not just like a ideological position. This is based on real life examples. In a lot of instances where the dwellings in the end are owned by community housing providers, that provides this kind of enduring benefit to the state and to the community. Firstly, wherever we have provided grants directly or affordable housing delivered through not-for-profit community housing providers, we have been able to retain that in perpetuity. So even with the NRAS funding, which was directed towards the community housing providers and not-for-profit community housing providers, we know that almost 40% of that, more than 40% of those incentives under NRAS went to not-for-profit community housing providers in New South Wales, and the remaining 55% odd went to the for-profit sector. All those for-profit subsidies, all those properties delivered through those subsidies are falling off now as NRAS is finishing, but all the subsidies that went to the community housing providers, they are retaining those affordable housing dwellings in perpetuity. CHPs can leverage assets and they can create more supply at no cost to government. So back in the GFC, the first GFC, when there was the nation building program, we transferred, even this was state government transferring title of almost 6,000 dwellings to the community housing sector in New South Wales. That was a start, that was a turning point of the growth of the community housing sector in New South Wales. It built their balance sheets, enabled them to borrow, and even for those 6,000 dwellings at no cost to government, the sector created 1,300 additional affordable housing dwellings based on our leveraging targets. So that's why we believe it's a good thing, especially when councils are considering affordable housing in their patches. Transferring the ownership provides an ongoing, enduring benefit. It's a gift that keeps on giving, because that asset can sit on their balance sheet. They can keep on refinancing and leveraging that to create additional supply at no additional cost for councils or for state government. And there are ways of there's ways of safeguarding that asset in perpetuity as well. Under the regulation, we can actually register an interest on title, and I'm sure councils can put caveats. So then the community can be assured that that affordable housing will remain in the community in perpetuity. So there's ways of doing that. So if there are concerns from the community that, why are we transferring ownership to a not-for-profit, there are ways of securing that asset as well. We have, I think this modeling done by Shearer through Paxton is that shows that CHPs can deliver more properties than if any tier of government is delivering that, and that could be through various ways. But because of the debt, where they can bring in debt or deliver the product more efficiently and cheaply, that investment is better delivered by the not-for-profit sector. And it can be cost-effective for councils. There's no ongoing cost. Like once you have delivered the affordable housing product in CHP ownership, you don't have any property-related costs, you don't have any management-related costs, no asset recycling costs going forward. So that can be quite an attractive proposition, that you get affordable housing in your council area and there's no ongoing cost attached to it. But you still get the benefit, your community benefits from a discount to market rent product. So very quickly, I think this is no surprise, or this is not new information for anyone, but where we have worked with councils and community housing providers, we've used contribution schemes, and I'll give you a few examples. We've worked on planning agreements. There are a lot of examples of both gifted land by councils and concessional sales, and I'll go into some of those examples there as well. Other things that councils can do quite easily is maybe a streamlined fast-track approval process for affordable housing. I know I haven't seen any examples of that yet anywhere in any council jurisdiction, but that is something that could be considered. You could waive development fees, vary floor space ratios, parking requirements. So these are smaller scale things that can still help in affordable housing development. So now this part of the presentation, I am moving into examples. And I'm starting off with this example of City of Sydney because I think they have been a leader in the delivery of affordable housing through planning mechanisms. This was a city-based contribution scheme, and that goes back, I think, 2000 or 1999, or even before 1994, I think. So they have been a front runner in that and a leader. And the mechanism really was quite simple. Developers contribute 0.8% of residential and 1.1% of non-residential floor space, or a monetary equivalent, to the City of Sydney Council. And then, of course, that was like years ago, but then that scheme was expanded to other areas of the City of Sydney as well. So they have a very long-standing commitment to affordable housing and using contribution schemes. So then they have transferred those direct grants to a community housing provider. At the time they set up, there was a company set up by the state government called City West Housing, which owns and manages the properties. I think it's roughly 900 dwellings have been delivered over the last few years for key workers and low-income households. And again, they do both income-based rents and discount to market rents, depending on, because it's a high-value market. Even if you apply a 25% discount to market rent, it's still quite unaffordable. So they do sometimes apply income-based rent as well. Now, I chose this one because it's again a contribution scheme. But why I used this example was this was again specific to the southern employment lands in the City of Sydney. But a contribution was collected from the developers and then passed on to a community housing provider. And in this case, the community housing provider didn't wait and secure land and build on it, and that took 4 or 5 years. They were able to secure a typical walk-up brown brick block that was cheap. In the cheaper part of City of Sydney, City of Sydney is very expensive, so in a slightly cheaper part of City of Sydney. And they're fully upgrading it with a lot of kind of environmental things. I think solar panels and other things. I'm not sure whether anybody from Bridge here, but it's a fabulous initiative. And then again, it will be affordable housing units for working Aboriginal women on very low to moderate income. So there are various ways of delivery. It's not just like brand spanking new buildings that take 5 years to deliver. You can actually give the money to a CHP who can just buy a block. And these kinds of blocks are quite good for a discounted product because they don't have the high cost overruns of lifts and concierges and all of the trimmings of a new development. And they're well built, high ceilings, open on 3 sides. So I'm quite a big fan of this product. I'm not sure others are or not. Again, I think in this example, there was a co-contribution from the community housing provider. So because they were getting title of this land, their boards were quite comfortable contributing to that as well, because that asset would have been in the ownership of the organization in perpetuity. And I'm pretty sure in 5 years' time, based on the value increase, they will refinance and build more affordable housing. So that becomes like a gift that's keep on giving. This example is from St. Mary's. This is Western Sydney. Again, this was a planning agreement. I must say this wasn't a planning agreement negotiated by a council, but this was federal government land. It was a former defense site that was rezoned, and as part of the rezoning, there was an arrangement with the state government where we asked them to set aside a proportion. I think it was 3% from memory, 3% of the lots for affordable housing. So the developer Lend-Lease provided 120 lots to a provider, Blue Chip, at no cost. The provider then brought in, I think, almost 70% of the cost of the development of those 168 affordable housing dwellings through debt, and there was a small cash contribution from the state government. But that layering of funding facilitated 168 affordable housing dwellings. This is like a greenfield development and a very standard product, as you can see. Easier and cheaper to build. It's not a high-rise or medium-density product. It's totally indistinguishable. Actually, if you go down to Jordan Springs, if anybody from Sydney, and you drive through, the affordable housing units are of way better quality than the mainstreams, what the private developers are building. Because that's all cookie cutter, and they have really deliberately tried to sort of make every house slightly different. This is another example of in Rouse Hill, again Northwest Sydney, again a voluntary planning agreement, 3% lots for affordable housing. DCJ tendered for the CHP partner. And I forgot to sort of mention that for the City of Sydney examples as well, we either jointly, so we can help council procure the community housing provider, and we've done a lot of these either joint tenders with councils, where because of if you don't have already an existing relationship with a community housing provider, local community housing provider, or if you have multiple community housing providers in your jurisdiction and you want to choose one, we can always, because of our deep knowledge of the sector and our fairly advanced tendering kind of process, we can help you actually find a community housing provider to do your affordable housing project. And then the ownership transferred to Link Wentworth Community Housing, and there were 38 affordable housing dwellings. So there was some high-rise in there as well. The photo is for the townhouse product. Again, a product totally indistinguishable from the private and perhaps of better quality. This is an interesting one. This was a planning agreement with Leichhardt Council. Now it's part of Innovest Council. And the agreement, the voluntary planning agreement, was delivering 7 units, but because we got a community housing partner involved, in this case Bridge Housing, they were able to leverage additional funds and create additional 4 units. So this is just trying to demonstrate the value of having a planning agreement with a not-for-profit community housing provider involved, because they can then leverage that to create additional affordable housing over and above what was negotiated in the VPA. So instead of 7, we got 11 affordable housing dwellings. The next 2 examples are on gifted land, so gifted operational land. So this site is in Lismore, which, as most of you know, was devastated by floods, and they don't have a lot of land that is not flood prone. So this is high up in Gunalaba. And with this land, the council decided to give the land at no cost to a community housing provider. Landcom was also, there were 2 agencies, state government agencies involved in that partnership. There was Landcom, who's developing the site. And then we are now partnering with council and Landcom to do a tender to find a CHP. I think the tender is happening as we speak, or is in the process of happening. And once that is complete, at the moment, I think the site feasibility is roughly around 40 affordable housing dwellings. But really for the council, just providing land that wasn't that expensive, but getting an outcome of 40 affordable housing dwellings is quite good. Because otherwise, if they were developing it themselves, they would have had to put in all the costs to develop, and then ongoing management and maintenance. So I think that just took away all those immediate and ongoing costs for the council. The land they will give to the community housing provider, and then that will then create the supply. And I think most will be debt from the community housing provider to actually build the units. And this is another fabulous example, Shoalhaven City Council. Again, a fabulous council that had, I think, one of the first regional councils that in New South Wales that had an affordable housing strategy. We partnered with them. They gifted land to Southern Cross Community Housing near Bomaderry Town Centre. And the land value represented only 14% of the cost, so very low cost for the council, but a huge benefit because both CHP and the community housing provider and the state government then contributed. So bulk of it is coming from the provider. 55% of the cost was coming from Southern Cross Community Housing. And this provider was successful in one of our grant programs through a tender process. So that's another contribution that DCJ is making towards this, and that represents 30% of the cost. But for the council, 14% of the actual cost of the whole project is what their contribution is, and they're getting, around 40 dwellings, high quality dwellings in a very good location. So I'm not sure how I'm going with time, Liz. I'm coming close to it, sorry. So I'll go very quickly through these last few slides. These are examples of land sold to community housing providers at a discount. And City of Sydney, as I said, is a front runner in this. They've sold land in Green Square to City West Housing and to SGCH. And I think, again, there's another one that I'll mention in a subsequent slide. They have provided more than 20 million discounts to CHPs to subsidize land sales, so which is a great achievement on their part. And lastly, this is a very interesting example. Again, this was a depot in City of Sydney that they were trying to repurpose. They sold this land to SGCH at a discount. SGCH debt and some DCJ grant funding from the SAF program allowed them to deliver a very fabulous high-rise product in the middle of in the middle of Sydney. 162 units, 40 social, 120 affordable housing, and 27 units for people with disabilities, and 45% of the units will be allocated to Aboriginal households because Redfern is a traditional area of significance for our Aboriginal community. So again, a fabulous example. I mean, this is. I mean, if anybody is even driving past this is quite interesting to have a look at. And I think that's my last slide. So thank you so much. Thanks for listening.
And I think what's really good about your presentation is it shows the partnerships, but also ones that have actually been delivered and gone from the planning right through to delivery. So often we sort of still sit in the planning idea stage, but you've actually got examples of where it's actually on the ground and people are living there. So I think that's fantastic. Thank you. Glenn, would you like to go next?
My presentation today, A Rock and a Hard Place, I don't want to put a downer in terms of the opportunities that local governments can play in terms of being a partner in increasing the supply. And I think there's some great examples out there where councils are actively involved in that space. So what I wanted to touch on is, I suppose, to extrapolate a lot of the other things of critical roles that councils play both in the housing and homelessness spaces. But firstly, before I commence, I also would like to acknowledge traditional custodians of the land in which we're meeting today. Also pay my respects to other First Nations peoples who are here at the conference and attending virtually. Also, I'd like to shout out to my local government colleagues who are here today, both in the audience and attending the conference. And in no way is my presentation representative of all the experiences and diversity of roles and interventions that local governments are undertaking. In looking at the title of this presentation, or this session today, the building role of local governments, I've reframed the question slightly. My premise here is about, rather than focusing on the housing outcomes in terms of increased supply, I think it's valuable to consider more broadly, what roles can local government play in creating pathways towards housing solutions? That is by focusing on the journey. Again, we've heard from Liz in terms of the huge diversity in the geography, scale and jurisdiction of local governments across Australia. So whilst there's huge variations, there are some commonalities that I think are shared across the local government sector. Bit of a personal reflection for me, as Liz indicated before, I've come from a housing background working in the community sector and then landed in local government over the last, my journey over the last 20 odd years. But interestingly, at the city of Brimbank, way back in 1998, fresh out of university, I was engaged as a consultant to do a housing needs assessment in the city of Brimbank at that particular time. Fast forward to 2015, after working in various different metro and rural councils across Victoria, I found myself at City of Brimbank as an employee. What I found there in that ensuing time between developing that housing needs assessment and landing as an employee at City of Brimbank was that there was no clear policy direction that existed around councils' roles and potential pathways for interventions around increasing the supply of social and affordable housing. One of the factors that was at play then was the council at the time had been sacked by the state government. There was government-appointed administrators who, as it turned out, were in place for 8 years. When I started there, staff were explicitly told that housing was not a core role for council and that's not our business and to stay out of it. So in the ensuing time, I've been at Brimbank now for 8 years. In 2017, we welcomed the return to elected representatives in council. As part of that strategic positioning and engagement with particular communities across Brimbank, that the community was telling us that housing need is critical and council should be playing a greater role in that space, and that was shared by the elected representatives. So after a lot of strategic positioning, and evidence gathering around need and potential interventions, in 2022, the current elected council endorsed a position statement on social affordable housing, and I think that shows you the length of time it takes around just to get housing up as an area of strategic priority for a lot of councils, not all, of course. A little bit about Brimbank, as Liz indicated before. City of Brimbank is in Melbourne's west, a population of around 200,000 people, really culturally diverse, over 150 different languages spoken. Over many decades, there's been a transition from, I guess, in terms of the population profile, from a traditional working class area of the West, where there traditionally has been a relative supply of affordable housing options, albeit with pockets of need. But what we're seeing now in 2021, the level and extent of housing need has shifted towards a combination of factors in terms of high levels of socioeconomic disadvantage, poor health outcomes, but in addition to that, we're seeing increased levels of primary homelessness, and you would have seen that from that slide I put up in my introduction, that photo was taken outside one of our libraries. So we're increasingly seeing instances of rough sleeping, but we've also had, I guess, a more hidden nature of homelessness in terms of severely overcrowded dwellings, and that's for a range of reasons. So what we're seeing is really intergeneration and entrenched socioeconomic vulnerabilities that are really contributing to high levels of stress, housing stress. At the same time, whilst looking at the negatives, there's some really positives in terms of City of Brimbank's strategic importance in terms of its location in Melbourne's west. Sunshine, which is the primary principal activity centre, is now being touted as Melbourne's second CBD. State government has designated Sunshine as a priority precinct for major infrastructure projects, such as Melbourne Airport Rail Link, and whilst that's currently being called in by the feds in terms of reviewing all of those major infrastructure projects and reflecting on how easy it was to get to the conference, taking Brisbane's airport rail. So things like that, where Sunshine would be one of the stops on the Melbourne Airport Rail, but also other state government initiatives like Suburban Rail Network. So we see that as that's going to be a primary driver for major infrastructure investment from both governments and private sectors, and in terms of increased levels of housing development. So I argue that really represents one of those once-in-a-generation opportunities for council to be able to effectively leverage a lot of that investment into ensuring that there's a diverse range of social and affordable housing options that are provided into the future. So talking about the role of local government, this has been touched on in Liz's introduction and also through Humair's presentation. I'd argue that still there's no clear mandated role for councils in housing and homelessness policy in practice. Whilst the National Housing Accord is a step forward, I think there still needs to be a little bit of work to be done in that space. Humair has talked extensively about those councils that are active in direct contributions and partnerships, and I think they're really laudable and need to be encouraged and facilitated. Majority of councils, I like to think that there's a spectrum from councils who don't see themselves as having a minimal role in social and affordable housing. It might be limited to advocacy. Others that are much more active at the other end of the spectrum in terms of direct contributions. I see Brimbank as one of those many councils. We're somewhere in the middle in terms of we have a legitimate role around advocacy, a role around land use planning, and also facilitation that might lead to partnerships down the track. So we're one of those councils. We're wanting to do more. We're probably not sure all the levers aren't quite in place in terms of to take the next steps. But I also argue that councils already, through their diverse range of functions, are playing a number of important roles, and that's not just on the supply side. Quite a few of you will have seen Uhuri's typology of housing policy across the 3 tiers of government that was released in 2023. You'll see down the bottom there that, and again, it's generic by nature because of the huge variation across local governments across Australia. So we can see here that there are 3 key roles identified for local government, being planning, administration, rates collection and local infrastructure. When we sort of unpack this a bit more, what we're seeing particularly across states and territories, that quite often the states see council's primary role is through the land use planning system, but quite often that's in a pejorative sense where, and it's been raised at this conference as well, that there's a perception that councils are slowing up the planning and approvals process, when we know that there's evidence to the contrary, and it's more restrictions on actually getting those planning approvals through to getting houses on the ground. Also, we're seeing, as Humair has pointed out, the states are encouraging councils to get involved in more direct forms of contribution of land and other assets. As I said before, these are really important initiatives, but I would argue that there are some barriers to councils being able to make direct contributions. As Liz indicated before, councils are really fiscally challenged. In Victoria, we've had a rate capping regime for quite some time now, where there's really restrictions on how much revenue council can raise from rates, and also competing priorities for other essential services provision as well. So there's a real balancing act about what are the trade-offs about making direct contributions and to what extent we focus on other delivery of other human services. So I'm arguing again, we shouldn't just focus on supply-side responses. When we're looking at local government, it's also critical to look at demand-side solutions. So I'll just step briefly through some of the things that local governments are already active in terms of identifying and responding to increased demand. I don't need to point out to anyone in this room that local governments are the level of government that's closest to the communities that they serve. What is common to the majority or all local governments to some extent, that they provide some form of community services that extend across the lifespan. These services are based on analysis of population profiles and what their particular needs are for those services now and into the future. I argue, and a number of councils are already doing this, that this can be extended to analysis of housing need. When I look back at that work I did for council way back in 1998. But what we're seeing in addition to that is that councils quite often are being seen to play a role as first responders to people at risk of homelessness, or, as I indicated before in that slide, those particularly acute examples of people rough sleeping, our libraries, neighbourhood houses, customer service areas, they're quite often the first port of call for people at risk. I argue that councils aren't adequately resourced or equipped to be able to make those responses, let alone to connect people with the services, housing and homelessness services that they need. Sorry, I got my slides wrong. But again, this is an area which I think needs to be further unpacked in terms of how do we support councils to be able to play that first responder role and then connect people to the services that they need. Probably part of that is also councils already have strong partnerships in place with health and community service providers that can be leveraged further to ensure that even some of those risk factors around people who may be experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness are addressed, that again playing a really critical preventative and early intervention role. I turn my attention briefly to supply side focus, and we've already talked to some extent about these particular areas. So land use planning role is pretty common to most local governments across Australia. These four roles that I've highlighted here come from Brimbank's social affordable housing position statement. What I'd like to highlight here is the planner role, the advocate role and facilitator role that I mentioned at the outset of the presentation in Council's position statement. These three roles are seen as core for Council. The role of partner with the hashtag there is seen to be a discretionary role for Council, so it's one that we're keen to explore in that space around using Council-owned assets and other contributions. But it is seen to be discretionary, subject to budget and other priorities or opportunities around securing funding. It's interesting, I just got an email this morning about from our assets area, which is about, we have regular meetings in council about looking at any surplus or underutilised government land or council land that can be used for those purposes. So it's not like it's not on the agenda, but again, it's balanced around other particular needs and priorities that councils may have. I'll turn to some solutions now, and look, none of these will come as any surprise to you, and some of these have been touted earlier in the conference, particularly through Sally Capp, the Lord Mayor of Melbourne's presentation on day one of the conference. But I see these again, these are some of the potential pathways to getting some housing solutions that local government can play a critical role in. The first one is, again, this has been extensively explored, not just in this conference, but through various discourse over many years in terms of the need for mandatory planning mechanisms such as inclusionary zoning. I won't go into the arguments about why that's needed. I think it's self-evident there. What is needed when we look back at that Uhuri's housing policy typology, that you've got alignment across federal, state and local jurisdictions in terms of the role of the planning system. And I think that there really needs to be national leadership in terms of providing frameworks that can be applied through state planning provisions and then applied at a local level. The addition to that would be, I'd say, is again based on council's knowledge and understanding of housing needs at the local level, that there to be alignment in terms of how can those mandatory contributions be leveraged and result in housing outcomes on the ground. The second point there is, again, this has been around for quite some time, treating social and affordable housing as essential infrastructure. If there's an acceptance that that is the case, then the extension of that is then to see that applied through the planning system at a state level, through developer contributions, potentially other forms of levies on the private sector for contributions to social affordable housing. The third one is really what councils are best at in terms of the level of government closest to their communities. They're in a really good position. They understand their communities, what the need is, but also by virtue of that they're able to identify suitable locations for social affordable housing development, and more having that finer grained analysis to be able to then determine what housing types or diverse range of housing mixes on a particular development that will meet particular needs. And again, coming back to that notion that's been mentioned throughout this conference about well-located housing, and I think that's really critical. The last two potential solutions there, I think, are subject to strong partnerships between federal, state and local governments, so it is subject to some resourcing and support for councils to do work in this space. Is, I think, really looking at that area of direct contributions, firstly to do land audits of council land and more in-depth feasibility studies around suitability of future development of social affordable housing. But my argument is it's not just council land, it needs to be extended to all government land in those local government areas. And I've also heard at this conference as well that one suggestion was that it be extended to church-owned land as well. So I think we need to really cast the net a bit wider in that space. And finally, coming back to council being the first responders increasingly around homelessness or people at risk of homelessness, I think they can play a really important connecting role in terms of joining up people who are at risk of homelessness, not just with housing and homelessness support services, but also health and community services that they already have strong partnerships with on the ground. But again, councils need resourcing to be able to facilitate that. So in summary, I think the National Housing and Homelessness Plan is a great opportunity to formally acknowledge and mandate the role of local government in demand and supply side solutions, but again, alignment with federal and state funding programs that do support locally based interventions that are able to increase the supply of social affordable housing, but whilst at the same time the role of local governments in preventing homelessness and enabling early intervention. So as I mentioned during this presentation, we've seen through this conference, it's really, I think the planets have aligned in terms of we've got the three tiers of government all on board, where that political will exists. We need to use this unique opportunity to harness that collective buy-in by bringing and welcoming local government into the fold. So I look forward to the forthcoming National Housing and Homelessness Plan and how this can enable local governments to directly engage with housing and homelessness sectors, albeit with some level of government resourcing and support. So thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. That was amazing presentation, and it really covered, I think, really well the sort of issues that councils are dealing with. Certainly in our work across the 537 local governments, we see the full spectrum of the ones, you know, like your council, fully engaged in this area, to the ones that are, you know, may not have the resources, may have other challenges on their plates that they're dealing with, and just say, look, housing's not our role, we just can't do it. But interestingly enough, when we do talk to them, they say, oh yeah, but we've got some aged care units over here, or, you know, helping this women's refuge here. So some of them actually doing housing, but not in a very strategic or conscious sort of way. So you'll find that most councils are doing something in housing, even though they say they don't actually want the role in housing, which is an interesting, yeah, that's right. So no, that was a great presentation, thank you. We'll finish with Heather. Thank you, Heather.
Hello, everybody. Hi, my name's Heather Shearer. This is a research project that myself and my colleague Paul Burton have done. Many of you probably know Paul. And we have been working on this field for about 10 years now, actually. But before I start, Griffith University and myself, of course, would like to acknowledge the people who are traditional custodians of the land and pay respect to elders past and present. And we extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Now, this was my abstract for this. I'm not going to read it. You can read it yourself. But, you know, you all know that unaffordable housing is a huge issue, and there's complex challenges, as you've heard multiple times. It's a dysfunctional housing market. And so basically what we did is we have heard many, many times, and I'm going to go on to this other slide. And this is the stuff that we have found over the last 10 years when looking at tiny houses. And we've specifically been mostly focused up until now on the traditional tiny houses on wheels, but we've extended this research now into what we've called tiny, alternative, and temporary houses. And what's common is said is that councils are the biggest barrier to the tiny house movement, or else tiny houses are the solution to the housing affordability crisis. If another council permits tiny houses, we'll consider it too. Tiny houses on wheels are an affordable way to enter the housing markets. And if you permit tiny houses, the area will just become a slum. Now, basically, only one of those is really accurate, and that's number 3. And that's a Queensland planner told me. I won't say which council, it's one council in southeast Queensland. And they pretty much said, if council permits tiny houses, another council does it, then we'll also consider it. And increasingly it's become that more and more local governments are considering, at least in some way, to permit, whether it's whether it's slightly longer term than normal, or whether it's under a different classification, some aspect of whether you call it tiny houses or not. Also, this is aimed to be a bit provocative, this talk. So some of my conclusions, I'm not too sure whether some tiny house advocates might not like, but anyway. So basically what we did, we surveyed people who lived in tiny houses. We looked at social and demographic things and such like that. And every single question I ever get asked whenever I'm interviewed by the media is, how many people live in tiny houses in Australia? And the second is, what is a tiny house? But basically, the answer to both is, I have no idea. Because tiny houses, at least the ones on wheels, are generally still what they call under the radar. So they're in rural areas, they're in rural residential areas, in big acreages, for example. And mostly because they are, strictly speaking, on the borderline illegal. People don't actually want to admit that they live in a tiny house. So I have utterly no idea how many people live in a tiny house, so please don't ask me. But that depends, you know. So we decided to survey councils in Australia. So what I did is, as we all know, there's 537 councils in Australia, and the drivers of unaffordability, etc., is different in different councils. So basically we decided, okay, what we're going to do is choose pretty much any council that has an urban settlement of more than 10,000 people. And we used an Australian Bureau of Statistics, LAIC, or I don't think it's even valid anymore, but urban centres and locations. It is valid, but they rename their stuff every 5 years. So we identified approximately 250 councils to contact, and this is just a map I did of southeast Queensland, just because that's where I live. I actually live in Scenic Rim, not Brisbane. And we sent generic emails because I tried to find out the names of planners. And I just addressed planning staff to council at Brimbank, for example. And surprisingly, we got actually 147 valid responses, which is about 50% response rate, which is very surprising for a survey. You're lucky to get 10% normally. The majority worked in councils as planners, but the limitation is we should have actually asked local laws people and building and plumbing people, because I got a lot of responses from council planners saying, you don't know anything about our council, you don't know anything about our state, and it was deliberately generic, but anyway. And alternative and temporary and tiny houses are actually sort of managed by different aspects in different councils, and sometimes within very big councils they don't talk to each other. Okay, so just addressing it to planners, that's because I teach planners and I'm a planner myself, but you know, I should have expanded it out, and maybe the second phase of this research we'll do that as well. We also had semi-structured interviews with 9 respondents in Queensland, Victoria and Western Australia. It was just about 32 people said they wanted to be interviewed, but only 9 of them actually came round to being interviewed. And these are the categories of houses we asked for. We asked them on tiny houses on wheels, tiny houses on skids. That's basically just something that's craned onto a site. It's still temporary, but it's more permanent than on wheels. Shipping container houses, bus or caravan or van houses, site hut houses. I just got these off the internet. Park houses, you know, like in caravan parks in New South Wales, for example, has got lots and lots of manufactured house estates, so has Western Australia. Less so in Queensland. Garage or shed houses, modular houses, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, those are all the different dwelling types were surveyed. Generally speaking, that in the results for this thing, we differentiated temporary houses to the rest of them. Because the rest of them, as long as they complied with the building code, the National Construction Code, they were fine. Council didn't really mind most of those. Container houses have to be high cube, though, because there's a building code restricts roof heights. So pretty much we also asked a question, we asked a couple of other questions, but one of the first ones was is housing affordability an issue in your council area? A couple said strongly disagree, but you know, who knows in surveys? People notoriously lie in surveys. So I don't know any council in Australia where affordability is not an issue, but anyway. So 86% of our respondents worked for a council, 5% non-government planners, 4% used to work for a council, 2% worked for the state, and 3% other. Got a couple of academic, but I ignored them. So mostly, like most, you know, reflected population pretty much, except Queensland and New South Wales were the majority, a couple from the other states. Councils were extremely different in how they dealt with alternative and temporary dwellings, even within the state and even within the same council. Now, this is a rather confusing looking slide, and I did put my 15 minutes on and then I forgot to press go, so I don't know how long I've been talking, so please tell me. Brilliant. So pretty much within the differentiation, this is a confusing thing, but modular, site huts, container houses, etc., were pretty much, you know, as long as they were connected to services, etc. This screen's doing weird things. Okay, they were pretty much permitted by most. Most councils, sorry, I have no idea what this thing's doing. Sorry. Okay, I don't want to zoom in. Okay, are you doing it on purpose? Okay. So it's a bit confusing, this slide, but we had quite a lot of responses and it was just separated by state. But generally speaking, in terms of the qualitative responses, as long as it was capable of being connected to services or being certified, it was okay. The difficulty came when you spoke about mobile dwellings, like tiny houses on wheels, caravans, buses, and so on. And that was a much more fuzzy thing, as is well known. So what we also asked is, how long are you permitted to stay in the different types of dwellings? And I've separated this into tiny houses on wheels. And On the left-hand side was New South Wales. You can see Queensland is actually quite tolerant compared to states, but this is just counts, and of course it's qualitative, so you can't sort of extrapolate it to the rest of the country, of course. But there are quite a lot of councils in Queensland, for example, that permit tiny houses, Brisbane being one of them. Fraser Coast has just got, you can live for up to 6 months in a tiny house, which is considered a caravan. These are tiny houses on wheels. Scenic Rim, for example, as long as it can pass building and plumbing, because a lot of Scenic Rim, for example, is on septic tanks and things like that, so they want to make sure that any dwelling is not going to pollute the environment, for example. Another thing that's really, that councils a lot of council people, particularly in the interviews, came across and said, people are spruiking this type of dwelling or that type of dwelling as having not needing council approval. And pretty much the thing was, yes, theoretically, even in New South Wales, which is quite tolerant, it might be in an agricultural zone, it might be in a bushfire zone, it might be in a flood zone, for example. So it's really important to do things, and if anyone says that, that's probably, buyer beware. So some of the quotes that we got, for example, this is a planner from a major city. It was actually the Sunshine Coast. They said they didn't mind me saying so. The widest possible range of accommodation type, including tiny houses, to meet the wide variation in household circumstances. Then this one in South Australia, if used as a permanent dwelling, they need to meet the requirements to be habitable. It's really important that consistently, and I'll talk about this in the next couple of slides, but consistently that health and safety, amenity, non-pollution is very, very important, and we can all understand that there is a reason for that. Because I could go and build a tiny house on my driveway right now and it would fall down and probably kill me, if not do something else, because I am totally useless at that sort of stuff. But in the other one, if a residential building is proposed on wheels, it is classified as a caravan and subject to local laws. It can be on residential property no more than 2 weeks in any 8-week period. This one, we're currently in the process of reviewing our community amenity local law to include tiny houses. One of the largest barriers is the fire overlay. And that's really important. Climate change is a huge thing. It's important. They will need to be classified by a certifier as a secondary dwelling, be fixed, and come under the general restrictions. Caravans and other structures on wheels cannot be used permanently. This was anonymous, so not all of these I know where they come from. I just know the state and the size of the largest city in the area. And this is and I left this one in because it's really important, because we speak about tenant, but we also need to consider the fact that if we want to make different types of dwellings more acceptable, people who own the property and the landlords also have to be taken into account. We had a squatter on a farm property living in a caravan who had destroyed the farmhouse. The council refused to enforce its own caravan restrictions. The Residential Tenancy Act did not apply because it is a rural property and the person did not have a lease, yet the landowners could do nothing. So quite often you hear horror stories on social media, of course, and whether they're true or not. I let my property to this thing and they destroyed it or left 6 weeks worth of litter, for example. So it's important to understand that sort of stuff as well. Now, we also asked, what are the potential conditions for approval? And I've just highlighted those two in green. And I thought, and this was just my assumption, so that's why I asked the question, what if you get neighbour permission or the person pays extra rates? To be honest, most of the respondents didn't think much of that at all. But what the councils wanted, the people I interviewed, of course, was subject to zones and setbacks, connected to services, overlays certified. So there's a lot of thing around regulation. And also amenity. In the interviews, a lot of people brought up amenity. And they were more talking about amenity, obviously protection for the environment and everything else, but also amenity, what does it look like? Because if you're going to put something in a suburban area and, it's a camper van with, a whole lot of cars around it and all sorts of stuff and it's messy, people are going to complain. But if it's nice looking, and this sounds terribly trivial, but if it's nice looking, it's going to get far fewer complaints to local laws. Because as one person said, well, we don't bother to actually check up on anything unless someone complains. I shouldn't repeat this, and I won't say what state they came from, but this was my, from the qualitative responses, just the different open-ended questions in the survey and the codes we got from the qualitative research, and these were the general themes that came across. Climate change, housing general, and regulation and policy. And you can see regulation and policy was very, very important, and that's just how we categorized it. And then we also asked about short-term rentals as well, which I won't report on in this, but pretty much it was universally negative about short-term rentals. Okay, this probably comes as no surprise. So discussion and conclusion, and these are the last two slides. The tiny house movement, I started looking at it in 2013 or so, 2014. And it started out like people DIY in the, building their own thing, adapting a caravan, for example. The main driver hasn't changed. It's still unaffordable housing. But the average price at the recent Cleveland Tiny House Expo was around $140,000. And arguably, this is largely aimed at the Airbnb market. Because I was talking at a thing in Gold Coast recently, and there was two very distinct groups of people. It was people living on, say, Gold Coast hinterland acreage property who wanted to put a tiny house either as a quick dwelling for a family member or else to rent it out as Airbnb. In other words, pretty privileged people living on acreage. The second was the councils don't exist and they can't tell us what to do. Which is, whether it's the preppers or the anti-regulation or the sovereign citizens, but this is quite a distinct but very vocal minority. We can do whatever we like on our own property, which, which is not true, but anyway. But councils are definitely not the biggest barrier to tiny houses, but they do tend to be quite conservative. Hence the council that said, well, if another council does it, we don't mind doing it as well. And one thing I've often argued is that if you have a temporary planning instrument, which the state can do, like 2 years for emergency, you could have certain zones of certain councils where you can say, oh, have tiny houses or whatever in your driveway or your backyard. And so then everyone can else see that the world isn't going to come to an end if there's something, obviously with certain restrictions. And I mentioned that some Esperance in Western Australia, Fraser Coast, Brisbane, Scenic Rim. I am from Queensland, so I do know the Queensland environment a bit better. There's definitely the need is not in the rural residential area. As we've heard in every single talk just about in this thing, there's the need for infill in the middle and outer ring suburbs. And whatever type of tiny alternative temporary houses, it's a good way of rapidly giving infill in our urban areas where there's already services, so there's already transport, there's already jobs, and so on. Okay, this is a bit provocative. The last one anyway. To progress alternative houses infill and be acceptable to councils, it's important to ensure health, safety and amenity, to be able to be certified. And I noticed that at the Cleveland Tiny House Expo, there were far more modular type houses than previously. Ensure that adhere to zones, setbacks and other constraints. Much as I don't like setbacks to roads, they're there. And the more mainstream and accepted tiny houses and other alternative dwellings are, the more likely councils are to approve them. And the more accepted they are, the more the construction industry will be to embrace this type of building and costs will fall. So, but also we need to consider equity. Just because people have low income, should they be forced into tiny or substandard dwellings of whatever definition? We'll put granny or the older child who can't afford a house, they can live in a little tiny house or a garage or a shed, but well, that's not really very equitable, is it? So it's something we also need to understand. But this is some heresy. Tiny houses on wheels are not the solution. They're expensive, they're inaccessible, they're space constrained, blah, blah, blah. You can read it. They're very, very inaccessible. I said if you don't own the land, rather buy a caravan. But anyway, probably going to get shot for this. And modular and kit houses are fantastic. I am really promoting modular and kit houses. They're quick to build, and they can be built just as nicely, and they can be approved by council. But they're great for Airbnb. Thank you. Yeah, I know.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thanks very much, Heather. And it's great to have that provocative sort of look at it as well, rather it's just not, you know, plain sailing to get these things into our communities. So we now have time for some questions. Great. Okay, if you could just wait to get the microphone. If you're online, just remember to put your question using the Q&A tab. Don't have any online questions at this moment, so we've got the floor here. So if you could just say where you are from and the question, and just keep the question short, that would be great. Thanks.
Thanks, Liz. My name's Mike Collins. I'm from Marybeck, formerly Moreland Council in Melbourne. I've got a pretty rare role in local government because I'm a specialist kind of senior advisor in social affordable housing in a local government, and we've talked a bit, I think it's touched on in Humair was talking about the relationship with councils and the work that's been done there, but in particular Glenn was talking about what is the role and the range of roles government can do, local government can do. I'm wondering, kind of, I find in a council that has a lot of ambition in terms of social and affordable housing, and seeing a lot more local governments coming to that space, having more ambition, you can end up trying to do a lot of things and wearing a lot of hats. And I feel sometimes I wear so many hats, it's kind of, the hair's gone now. But if I'm wondering about the thoughts on, if there's still only limited resources and it's not going to go away in terms of local government, what is the future roles or the future skills that need to be in local government that's going to give the best kind of bang for buck, where as against other functions, maybe like state government support, which is great, which you have in New South Wales for certain functions, or philanthropy, not-for-profits doing some of that work, you know, what is the skill set for local government social and affordable specialists in the future?
Do you want to have a go at that first? Glenn?
Thanks for your question, Mike. I probably look at myself in terms of that, where for a time I would have considered myself a housing specialist in terms of policy and research and advocacy, but now I'm a generalist in terms of the breadth of the roles I currently hold at Brimbank, which has got much more of a community health and wellbeing frame. In some ways that's good because you get to see the bigger picture and the interconnections as well. I'd probably reframe that more specifically to look across again, to break down the silos across council, particularly with the planners, the community wellbeing sort of areas of council, and the more the building and sort of amenity type functions. You really need a role that can, or integrated processes that can work across all of those domains to influence those outcomes.
I think we're also seeing a lot of councils coming together to share capacity, skills, knowledge, and also resources. So we're seeing in some councils, like they share a planner between 5 councils or something, or a supervisor planner to help the junior planners because they can't get senior planners. So I think we're probably going to see a lot of these different ways of working, and also networks across councils to actually share knowledge, share best practice, what works, what doesn't work. And councils are very good at doing that. We've done it for a long, long time, sharing equipment, helping each other out in emergencies and things like that. And I think this is just another area where I think there's going to be a lot of that cross-fertilisation and support going on in our sector, because it is a unique sector. It's not something the state government can just come in and do. It's really stuff that the local government's got a lot of expertise and knowledge built up over a lot of years about their communities. So, we're seeing some of that sort of work across the country as well. Does anyone else want to say?
I would like to add something to that. I think if a council doesn't see itself, and probably shouldn't, as a housing agency, then rely on the community housing providers that are operating in your area. They are housing agencies. They're set up for housing. So you don't have to have all those skills in-house. Rely on the skills that are in your community.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karen Januszewski. I'm a board member of Unity Housing. So this is a bit of a question / comment. So there are 537 local governments across Australia. There's probably 35 housing associations of enough capacity to raise debt around Australia. So it's a bit of a cautionary tale that local government cannot continuously run RFPs and RFQs all the time and tenders, because the housing associations just don't have the capacity or the resources to be in that continual tendering process. And, you know, for every dollar they spend on doing a tender, it's a dollar they're not putting into housing. I'm interested if any of you have witnessed and looked at how they're managing that process in Europe around a trust model and a continual process rather than an RFP process.
Look, does anyone on the panel want to... I mean, we also have Wendy Hayhurst here, who's the CEO of Shearer. I don't know whether you want to say or add to that, Wendy, about your observations in your sector. Oh, we just need a microphone down the front, please.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. We've actually just been, perhaps I shouldn't say this, with the ACT Chief Minister actually talking about exactly the same issue that you're talking about. And for my sins, I used to be head of housing in a local council back in the UK, where it's very different. I know, lots more responsibility, but lots more funding. But what we would do is we select preferred partners. So that isn't a tendering process. That's an expression of interest, and then we worked with 3 organisations, and any opportunities that we had went to them, and that's the model that I would definitely advocate here.
Do you want to add to that, Glenn? Do you want to add to that comment?
Yeah, and that's exactly what's happening. City of Sydney has that, and I think a lot of councils are doing that. So as simplified a process that you can run, because you know you don't want resources tied up with financial advisors and legal costs and all of that.
Sorry, the lady here has a question, but just on the point of debt, Veer Longmore from Launch Housing, the notion of leasehold transfer will solve all the problems. We're moving to a debt subsidy model for funding of community housing for the next couple of decades, so very hard to raise debt under leasehold. Freehold is what's required, so I think that's an important point as well.
Sorry, I know there's someone at the back that had a question, but I'm going to take advantage of the microphone while I've got it. Hi, guys. My name's Kiri. I'm from Ballina Shire Council. And I just wondered what your thoughts are, particularly yourself, Humair, about how we can get some more thought leadership around housing supply in regional areas for regional councils. In the session this morning, we had a great discussion about some of the unique context and constraints that regional councils are facing, or regional areas. Huge migration post-COVID, lack of housing diversity, really unique land constraints around high areas of ecological sensitivity. You know, we're seeing these housing supply goals butting up against these environmental protection goals in a really awful way in places like where I live, and there's not very much money in environmental protection, to be fair, so it's the thing that always falls to the back of the list. We heard from earlier this morning from Queensland, who are doing some really interesting work around local housing action plans, and also Victoria, but sorry to put you in the firing line, Humair, but it seems a little bit like New South Wales State Government is missing in action when it comes to policy leadership around regional housing supply. And a lot of the solutions you propose, they're just not working in regional areas for issues to do with scale and land economics, you know. And like for my council, we're lucky to own, we've got 30 residential lots ready to build on, and another 60 in Lennox Head in beautiful coastal area that we want to do some affordable housing with. We can't get any interest from state government because we're not going to gift that land. I mean, maybe if you live in Lismore, you might have some land you're willing to gift, but in Lennox Head, I appreciate that there are no ongoing costs, but there's also no ongoing profit. And when council's income is restricted in every single way, we're not going to be gifting, you know, high value land to build affordable housing. We'll do it ourselves, you know, if we have to. So affordable housing contribution schemes. I mean, Byron Bay just got theirs earlier this year. It's the only one, I think, outside of Greater Sydney. Took them 10 years to get action on short-term holiday letting. You know, we're really under the pump in regional Australia, so I'm just wondering how we can do better. Thank you.
Yes, I think there are a couple of questions that you've raised. I'm just trying to try and sequentially answer them. So, yes, I think every council area will require a different solution. So I think, you know, I mean, I know that Byron is looking at, you know, doing affordable housing on top of car parks. So you might think that you don't have the resources within your council area, but there's always ways of looking at things a bit differently. I think you mentioned aged care as well, Liz, initially. That's, I think, and yes, a lot of solutions that apply in City of Sydney are now probably applying in Byron because of the land value increases. That way you can actually get that land value sort of making some of the contribution schemes more viable. But I think with state, because I can't sort of speak for the whole state government and what their leadership might be in regional areas, but I think there will be a lot of capacity within the government, state government, to listen to voices in the regional area, especially after all the environmental calamities that have happened in your area and in, you know, in South Coast with bushfires and everything. There are specific authorities that have been put in place. So if councils can bandy together locally and have that voice, I'm sure the Reconstruction Authority, all those other places where these discussions could happen, I think they are. And I'm not sure whether council will need to force state government to sort of work in a certain way, but I can't speak for the specific aspect that you're talking about. The other thing I was thinking while you were speaking was that yes, you can think of land contribution as a council missing out on profit, but affordable housing will never be profitable. So if a council area ever, unless you want to trade that asset for a profit further down this track, right? If you want an affordable housing product in perpetuity only for affordable housing, then a land transfer is fine, a gifting, because you're getting the asset safeguarded in your community forever and for intended purpose of affordable housing. But yes, if you want to trade for value that same land for something else later, you know, so then yes, yeah, that's a different proposition. But if you want affordable housing, give the land, you get affordable housing.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to close that discussion off because we're sort of running out of time. I know there were some other questions there, but the panellists will stay here and ask and respond to other questions. So I just want to say thank you very much to the panellists today. It was a really good discussion. I think it's one we could go on a little bit longer. So my notes here say that lunch is being served in the foyer area, which is just outside this room, and we're back in the Great Hall at 1:30 for the final session. And for our virtual delegates, we'll see you back online in 1 hour. So thank you very much. It was a great session. Thank you. Sorry.